Three, two. Welcome to another episode of Million Dollar Stories, where we get to interview authors from all over the world. If you're an entrepreneur out there listening or watching, or maybe even watching live, this podcast is for you because there are many people out there who say you need to create a business that goes big time, keep growing and growing and growing, and they might lose that sense of greatness as they grow. Well, this book touches on that aspect. Small giants, companies that choose to be great instead of big. And so the author is with us today, Bo Burlingham. Thank you so much for being here, sir.
It's my pleasure and honor, Mike. I'm very pleased to be on your show.
Well, you are connected to a man named Jim Collins, who I had the co-author of his book, I believe it was Built to Last,
Yeah.
on. I did not have Jim Collins, but I mean, Jim Collins is giving you a shout out, and I'm just going to read off a little bit. This well-written book should inspire thousands of entrepreneurs to reject a mantra of growth for growth's sake in favor of passionate dedication to becoming the absolute best. Bo Burlingham reminds us of a vital truth. Big does not equal great, and great does not equal big. You know, I'm a 5'7.5" guy. I've been saying that my whole life, Bo. So that was a quote by Jim Collins, and that's why that's mind blowing. Jim Collins obviously has sold millions of books, and here you are with 567 reviews on Amazon. You're obviously picking up steam on Amazon. How many copies of your book have been sold? Do you know?
No, I have no idea.
Man, amazing. So tell us about the genesis of this book. When did you come up with this philosophy and you realized that the world needed to read it?
Well, actually, the way the book came about was that I was a uh, an editor at large of Inc. magazine. Now, editor at large is a title that they give you when they don't know what else to call you. I I had been executive editor, but then I resigned as executive editor, and they said, "Okay, well, we'll call you an editor at large." And I said, "Fine. If anybody wants to get away with anything, just say you're at large, and uh, and you'll be fine." So, in any event, I was writing articles for Inc. It was one of the things that I was doing as an editor at large, and one of the articles that I wrote was about a company that I found fascinating called Zingerman's Community of Businesses, or started out as Zingerman's Delicatessen. And it was a fascinating story because this was a company that had started out in 1982 with the goal of being great and unique delicatessen. And by 1992, 10 years later, they they were mentioned by in magazines and newspapers all around the world as one of the greatest delicatessens in the world. And they had a lot of choices when they came to that point. For one thing, they could have become a franchisor. They could have opened franchise Zingermans around the country. For another thing is they could have raised private equity and started their own Zingermans around the country. But the two founders, Ari Weinzweig and Paul Saginaw, talked to each other and decided they didn't want to do either of those things. That once you start replicating something, it's no longer unique by definition. And a lot of times it isn't even very good, let alone great. And so they said they wanted to remain maintain their commitment to being great and unique, but they also felt that they needed to grow. So how should they do that? So they talked for a long time, and finally they came out with a vision in 1994 of what Zingerman's was going to look like 15 years in the future. Now, most of us have trouble thinking about 15 minutes in the future, but they were actually describing what this company was going to look like in 15 years. And they said it was no longer going to be uh, just the delicatessen. It was going to be a community of businesses. And
Wow.
each one of these businesses was going to be food related some way and carry the Zingerman's name. uh, and also be great and unique in its own field. So, if you do that, you could have a bakery, you could have a ice cream company, you could have a candy company, you have restaurants, and so forth and so long. So they that became that was their goal. They put it out in 1994, and by the time I went to visit them in, I guess it was in the early 2000s, they were already well on their way to achieving that goal. Um, but the thing that really struck me was that they managed to attract these incredibly experienced, uh, in many cases, very well paid people who left jobs at other places in order to become part of this sort of experiment that was going on in Ann Arbor, Michigan, namely building this community of businesses. And um, I was just, I was fascinated about how they did this, how they came up with this idea, and I wrote an article about it. The article was a cover story for Inc. magazine. It was called "The Coolest Small Company in America," and it was about Zingerman's. And well, one of the things, one of the people who read it was in fact a publisher, a book publisher, and he called me up and he said he loved my article on Zingerman's, but he had a question. And I said, okay, well, what is it? He said, are there other companies like this? I said, what do you mean? He said, companies that have chosen to do something, that have the option to get very big, very fast, but have chosen to do something else because they have goals they consider more important. And I thought, gee, that's a really great question. I'd been at Inc. for 30 years by that point, and I didn't know the answer to it. So I said, well, uh, that's a good question. I'm going to see if I can get an answer to that, and then we'll see if there's a book in it. So basically, what I did is I wound up doing a big investigation, asking all my friends and searching back issues of Inc. magazine and asking people to tell me, do they know any companies that in fact had decided that they had goals that they considered more important than getting big uh, and getting there fast. And every now and then, people would say, "Yes, you really should talk to this person," or they would send me. They say, "Well, what about this company?" And I began to investigate them, and lo and behold, I discovered that there were many, many more of these than I had ever imagined. And what's more, they were in every industry, in every part of the country. And I decided, that's my book. It's these companies that have uh, basically decided it's actually these entrepreneurs who have decided that they want to create something that's great and unique, that's different, but that is, from their point of view, is great, and that great didn't necessarily mean big.
Yep.
Great, there are many other definitions of great, and these were companies that weren't so interested in getting big. It's not that they didn't get big. Some of them did get very big, but that was not their goal. That was their byproduct of their goal. Their goal was to create something great. And for most of them, they had certain things in common that they were looking for. Number one, they wanted to be a great place to work. They wanted to be a place where people would actually line up to get a job with them because they'd heard it was so great. Number two, they wanted to have absolutely the best product or the best service in their industry. And they wanted to be recognized for that by other people in the industry. So if you ask a competitor, for example, what are the great companies in this industry? They would name your company among others. The third thing was that these were all companies whose customers just loved them. they had something that I called Mojo, which I defined as the business equivalent of charisma. You know, when you want to follow when a leader has charisma, you want to follow him or her. When a business has mojo, you want to be associated with that business.
Oh,
You want to work for it. You want to buy from it. You want to sell to it. And so you want to wear its t-shirts and its caps. If it's Harley Davidson, you might even get a tattoo. And these, that's what these companies had. And so in any event, I went out and I visited all these companies and I was looking for companies that had these qualities, and then I was going to write about them and write about what they had in common. So that's what Small Giants is. It's really that the result was Small Giants.
man.
In fact, I have to say that Small Giants was the last thing I came up with, the title of the book.
That's what I recommend, by the way, to all of our clients. You
Yeah,
write the content first, and
yeah,
then you come up with the title. Otherwise, if you come up with the title first, you're
yeah.
trying to marry every piece of content within the book back to that title, and it doesn't work. It stifles your creativity.
Well, that is very good advice that you give people, Mike. Um, the uh, the downside to that is that you wind up with a manuscript and suddenly you have to come up with a title for it, and you don't know what the title is. So what I did was I asked the various people I'd written about in the book uh, what they thought a good title would be, and there was actually one of them, a fellow named Jay Goltz, who had a photography business in Chicago, developing business and so forth, who said, well, you know, these are all companies that are trying to be great, right? And I said, yes. And he said, so they're giants. Well, sort of. And he said, but they're small. And I said, yes. So they're small giants. I, I said, okay, that's a good title. Talked to my publisher. My publisher loved it. And in fact, the term is caught on. It's actually being used now in other countries, even.
I love it.
Uh, so, but I did make some mistakes in that first book. Uh, and that's why I had to have a 10th anniversary edition. Because one of the things, after I wrote about all these great companies, a couple of them began to get into trouble. And I said, wait a minute, how can they be getting into trouble? I wrote about them because they were also solid and been around for so long. And I said, well, I need to investigate this to figure out what's gone wrong. And that led me to realize that I had missed an important chapter, and I needed to come out with a version of the book that had this chapter, and that's the 10th anniversary edition. And that
Wow.
chapter has a chapter called "How Small Giants Die," and it was about, you know, the conditions that can lead any company, small giant or any company, to go out of business. And you know, it's great to have all these great practices and to thrill all your customers and your suppliers and your employees, but it doesn't matter much if you're not in business.
Right.
If you can't pay your bills, essentially,
Right.
because when a company can't pay its bills, it's bankrupt. It's going out of business, and so that um, was in danger of happening to one of the companies that I wrote about. There was another company that really that was a great company. It was a computer special effects company in Los Angeles, um, called Rhythm and Hughes, and they were famous. You know, you know, the movie about the pig Babe in the City.
Yeah.
You know, the Chronicles of Narnia. You know, all the
Yep.
animals that move around, and Well, Rhythm and Hughes is the company that created that. They're really their greatest movie was Life of Pi, which had a boy on a boat in the middle of the ocean with a tiger. Well, there wasn't really a boy on a boat in the ocean with a tiger. Uh, that was all done by computer special effects, although it looked absolutely real. In fact, they won an Academy Award
I
for it.
remember that. Yep.
And eventually they won the Academy Award for Best Picture uh, for The Life of Pi. But they won it 10 days after they filed for bankruptcy. After they, yes. And so that became something that I had to write about because it was an important part of this story. And I wanted my readers to realize that there were these pitfalls that you could fall into no matter what happened.
Now, was there any common trend of a leader going astray, the leader leaving? Was there maybe an identity that was lost, or maybe a comfort level that they hit? Therefore, there was no pursuit of any greatness anymore. Anything you can lend to our audience that you noticed?
Well, I would say this: life goes on. People get old. That leads to my second book, which was called Finish Big. Every business owner leaves his or her business. Nobody stays there forever. You may get carried out feet first, but you're still going, you got to leave at some point. And that happened with some of the small giants. I mean, one of the companies I wrote about was Anchor Steam or Anchor Brewing, and it had a great CEO who was really very much attuned to the whole theme of small giants. His name was Fritz Maytag, but you know he was an older guy, and he wasn't going to last forever, and he had to figure out what to do when he left. And so he tried to look for people who he thought would carry on the business the way he'd conducted it. And he got found a couple of guys who basically said that they were going to keep it doing it the same way. But you know, after a few years, they had an opportunity to sell it themselves, and the best offer they could get was from Sapporo, which was a very large Japanese beer company. And so Sapporo bought the company, Anchor Brewing, and they ran it for a few years. And then after a while, they said, well, this doesn't really fit into their future plans. So they decided to shut it down. And the employees, of course, were shocked by this and said, maybe we can buy it. I don't think they did. But the point is that, you know, you're going to, yes, at some point, the only way you can preserve that mojo, I've found, there are only two types of companies that have preserved that mojo beyond the first generation into the second and third and fourth generations. And those are either family owned businesses or employee owned businesses. My theory is that there has to be somebody who protects whatever it is that makes the company special.
Mm-hmm.
And in family owned businesses, it's the family that does it. And in employee owned businesses, it's the employees. But if you sell a business to a third party, maybe you can find somebody who's going to keep the mojo for a while. But the chances of that happening after another sale is almost impossible. So
Wow.
that's what I would say.
Yeah, and I was thinking about when you first started off by outlining Zingerman's want to have a place where people wanted to work at, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
a culture, it's an identity, it's
Mm-hmm.
a sense of what they stand for. And I think a lot of companies start with that, but they lose that sense trying to becoming too diverse with thought, right? Too many cooks in the kitchen. And I think that that's what when I think of great companies, I think of there's like one vision, one core message. Like Apple has been able to withstand the test of time because it's all about think different, right? Just be
Yeah,
unique, right? So that
right,
might be how they get a certain type of person to jump on that ship and row together all towards the same direction. And you might even touch on this in your other book. By the way, guys, look him up. He has many books. One has 744 reviews on Amazon. And it's called The Great Game of Business, the only sensible way to run a company. And you're talking about in this book, I believe it's Jack Stack. And
yes,
it looks like a few pieces of or a few ingredients to his success is keeping score, having fun, playing fair, providing choice, and having a voice. And when you
right,
think about it, individuals want to be a part of a company that does all of that. So anything you
right.
could share amongst how to find help or make a place so valuable, so exciting to work at that individuals will be beating down the door to be there.
Um, Basically, that book, really the intelligence behind that, the writing is mine. I wrote the whole book, but the intelligence behind it is Jack Stack. And Jack Stack is the founder and CEO. I think he's now the chairman of uh, of what's now called SRC Holdings. And the whole premise of it, and the reason he calls it a game, the great game of business,
Yeah,
is because basically he says, you know, business is not an art, it's not a science, it's a game.
I agree.
And like every game, if you're going to win it, there are three conditions that have to exist. Number one, you have to get it. You have to understand it. You have to know the rules. You know. Number two, you've got to be getting enough information so that you can follow the action and keep score. Uh, Number three, you've got to care about whether or not you win or lose. Um, that's
Yeah,
just that for that you need a stake in the outcome. It's got to matter to you whether you win. Think about a sport you don't understand, like cricket or something like that.
yeah,
Um, and I mean, I don't understand cricket at all,
either
but
do I.
I understand that if I wanted to know about cricket, number one, I'd have to know what the rules were. And number two, I'd have to be able to keep score. And number three, I'd have to care about whether or not my team won or lose or lost. So and he basically what Jack said was that's the way businesses run, and that you could teach anybody the fundamentals of business if you just understand that this is what business is. You know, you don't need an MBA. You don't have to work for some big company. It's not mysterious. It's a game, and you've got to figure out what the game is. You got to know what the game is, and then you got to play it well.
Yeah. I always tell people, I mean, and maybe I get this from Alan Watts. Have you ever heard of Alan Watts? Do you know who
Of
that is?
course, yes, yes,
He says the way to succeed in your career is to see no distinction between work and play.
yeah,
And man,
yeah,
did I adopt that because every day I wake up and I feel like when you have an idea and you bring it to life, you're just a kid playing in the woods again,
yeah,
right? All you're doing is manifesting these ideas. Like, do we have ideas or do ideas have us?
yeah,
That's another way to
yeah,
look at it. And so by playing this game, what's cool about it is that you do get better. I'm
yeah,
not a cricket player, but if I played for 10 years straight, I bet I
yeah,
would be pretty good as compared to who I am today, right? So
yeah.
you get better at it. And I think you only get better at things you truly enjoy. And so
I
maybe you got to convince yourself to enjoy what you're doing. Am I right?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, why do most of us get jobs? Well, we get jobs because we need money and to survive, and we need an income. But the fact is that if that's the only reason you're getting a job, it's not necessarily going to be something you like. The key thing is to find a place to work, or people to work with, or people to work for, that are going to allow you to have fun while you're doing it. And
Yeah.
and then you get to make money and have fun at the same time.
That's it. That's it. And so when you're building a culture, right? You don't want it
Yeah.
to be a prison. You want it to be a playground. And yeah, there are, and I guess that's probably the best way to look at it. When individuals are more open to ideas, they're more willing to try things.
Uh-huh.
They're willing to maybe endure challenges, right?
Uh-huh.
They're willing to get their knees scraped and hurt every once in a while if it's fun to be there.
Yeah, that's right.
That's a great way to look at it. I'm glad you brought that up because I say that to people. And when I get on these weekly calls with our team, it
Yeah.
does feel like that we're all kind of just playing together, right? All right, so
Uh-huh.
how are we gonna accomplish this goal, right? All right, we're gonna bring this client's book from here to the finish line, and it's gonna be fun, right? So I realize that that's what brings out the best in me, and I'm assuming it's universal. It happens to everybody. If you are enjoying it, you will want to be a master of it. You will read more about it. You'll study more. You will go to events. You will try to perfect it more because you enjoy it.
Well, I realize that this is an interview of me by you, but I could very easily turn this into an interview of you by
Yeah.
me, uh, because I'm a journalist, and my instinct is when you say all those things, well, I'd like to know more about your business and about who the other members of your team are and what the different people are doing. Uh, but because if you get into it, once that's all. Again, it's all about learning what the game is, and um, I think, Mike, that you've got it. You know what it is. You know what your game is.
Yeah. Once you identify it, you never want to let go of it, I guess is probably the best way to put it too.
Yeah, it's true.
So you bring up your experience as a journalist. What made you get into that profession? Were you just a curious individual? And is there any incredible story that stands out in your life that, maybe when you think about your career, you're like, I can't believe I was able to get to do that.
Well, oh, that's a long question. Listen, Mike. I'm 77 years old. I'm going to be 78 in a week, uh,
Happy birthday, man.
and I've been playing my own game for the last 50 years or so.
You figured it out too. It's great.
Well, I don't know if I figured it out, but I did figure out a way to have fun while I'm working. I mean, I should um, qualify that by saying that I hate writing, um, and but I love everything that happens before I write a book. All the research and everything, and I love that everything that happens after I've written it. It's what happens in the middle where I'm putting words down on paper or putting pixels down on a computer screen uh, that I find agonizing. And uh, but in any event, I have found it gratifying enough to stick with it. I originally got into it because I needed a job. I was married. I had uh, one child, one little baby actually, and another one on the way, and I needed to make some money, and somebody offered me a job, and that's how I started out, and then I've just kept doing it ever since then. But I've had many different um, experiences along that. I mean, for a while, I was like a general interest magazine journalist. Like I wrote for Esquire magazine and Harper's and uh, magazines like that. And then I, um, I actually, well, this is a long story. You don't want to get into all of this. I basically, I, I needed being a freelance journalist, which is what I was to begin with, um, is no, is not something I recommend to anybody. It's feast or famine, mostly famine, and it's fine when you get paid if you get paid well for what you write, but if you uh, if you don't, there are all these dry spells where you're not making any money. And I realized at some point I had to get a real job, and I wound up getting a real job with Fidelity Investments, which I knew nothing about. They called me up to see if I was interested in the job, and they said, "Well, you don't want me. Um, I don't know the difference between a stock and a bond." And at that point, I didn't. And they said, "No, no, no, we could teach you all that. That's not big. We want somebody who knows how to write, and you know how to write." And I said, "Okay, well, I'll try it out." So for 1 year, I went to Fidelity Investments, and it was an eye-opening year for me because I learned an incredible amount, and it actually there were lots of things that happened that made me sort of question a lot of prejudices that I'd had before. And when after a year, I got recruited. Basically, somebody called me up and said there was this new little magazine in Boston, Massachusetts, where I lived, called Inc. Magazine, and it was a startup in Boston, and they're looking for people who have a background in general interest magazine writing and who also know something about business. Well, I'd been at Fidelity for a year, so I knew a very tiny bit about business. It's true, and so I interviewed for the job, and they liked it, and they hired me, and I became at first the senior editor, and then their executive editor, and I was just learning that whole time. Now I find learning a lot of fun, so I guess that counts.
It's 30 years you were there, is that right?
What?
You were there
30?
for 30 years.
I think it was more like 35. I started in 1983, and I left in 2016. So,
Wow.
yeah, yeah,
Amazing. So,
yeah.
were you able to interview any incredible leaders or, managers that stand out in your life as maybe examples of people we should follow?
Well, I interviewed Steve Jobs.
Oh, nice. What was that like?
That was uh, that was great. We had named him our entrepreneur of the decade, and uh, he agreed to be interviewed for that. So I went to interview him, and uh, I felt it was a very interesting interview. I loved doing it. Um, this was when he was not at Apple. It was in his sort of period when he was at Next.
Next and Pixar. He helped create that. Yeah, got it.
And uh, with Next, he he was reflective. He because it had been quite an upsetting thing to be kicked out of your own company, which he had been kicked out of,
Yeah.
and he but he still, in talking to him, he still had this idea about um, computers and what this technology uh, could do in the future. That you could almost, it was almost like it's almost like talking to Beethoven before he wrote his symphonies. It was like, I mean, it was after we interviewed him that he went back to Apple and he came out with first the iPod, then the iPhone, um, then
It was the
the
iMac
tablet.
first. He brought it back with the
Yeah,
iMac.
the
Yeah.
iMac, exactly.
Yeah.
And, um, it was like one thing after the other that he did. And it was, but I had the feeling in interviewing him in whenever it was, 1970, 1989, that here was a guy who already knew in his head or by instinct that there were these tremendous possibilities ahead. if you took this technology and were really creative with it, there were tremendous possibilities, and that he just hadn't gotten around to doing them yet.
Hmm. Yeah, that's I mean, people look at him as one of the greatest of all time. So being able to interview him, I'm sure that's one of the highlights. Uh
Yeah.
and and the last question I have in regards to your book, you have the company Cliff Bar. Now, I
Yes.
believe Cliff Bar became pretty big after you wrote this book. So is there anything that stands out in your mind when it comes to that company?
Well, sure. I mean, they're an interesting story because the reason that they're in the book is because uh, they were about to be bought. They were well. There's a whole story about it. They were about to be bought back in 1980 or something, but then the founder Gary Erickson decided he didn't want to sell, and literally the lawyers were had come into town in order to sign the papers for him to sell this. And he took a walk around the block and he realized that he really didn't want to do this. So
Wow.
he sent them all home. And I thought, wow, that's amazing. And people said that he was crazy, that, he would have made uh, what was then a lot of money, um, and probably about $50 million or something like that. And um, they he he just said, "This is not right. This is not what I want to do. I think we can continue to build this company." And so that's what he did. Now, and that was the story that I told in Small Giants. Now, if you've been reading the newspapers uh, over the last, I don't know, couple of years, I forget what it was. Uh, he and his wife Kit um, did wind up selling uh, Cliff Bar and its associated its other products like Luna bars and so forth, and I forget all the names of them, but they sold it for like several $billion,
Oh,
and
man.
you know, having the strength to turn down an offer of $100 million is is takes a lot, or an offer of like $50 million for yourself personally. That takes a lot of willpower. But to turn down, $3 billion or whatever the final uh, amount was, that's a whole different animal.
But fascinating guy who had conviction and had vision. And I guess maybe that's really the difference between those businesses who try to just keep going bigger and bigger and they don't
Yeah,
care about quality as much, but
yeah,
staying great all along the way. If they get big, like you said, that's the byproduct, but that's not the dream.
right,
Wow.
exactly.
So outside of your own book or books, is there one that you recommend to our audience that you say, hey, guys, if you're going to read a book this weekend or this week, pick up this book? What would you say?
Well, I could name lots of books, but I suppose when we stay in the business category, I would say any book by Clayton Christensen, who is the late uh, um, professor at Harvard Business School who wrote about innovation. And his books on innovation are the best. They're the gold standard. There's nothing better out there. Um, the other thing I would say, though, is I am a friend of Jim Collins and I'm a big fan of his. Uh, Most people know his book, Good to Great, which is a great book, but it's not my favorite book of his. My favorite book is the one he wrote after that.
Built to last?
No, Great by Choice.
Uh,
Built to Last is a great book, but uh, Great by Choice is is more about entrepreneurs. It's more um, well, it's people who make the choice to be great, and there are many insights in it that I find very, very valuable. His I will say this is that because Jim only writes about public companies, their applicability to private companies, obviously most, the vast majority of companies are private. And uh, so that even so, he has, there are a lot of great ideas in his books that that anybody can follow. So, but I was the one I recommend when people ask me about his books is I recommend Great by Choice.
I have not read that one, so I'm gonna check that out.
Yeah,
And the other one
yeah.
was Christensen. I don't know that individual either.
Well, he his best known book is a book called The Innovator's Dilemma, and it talks about how um, why it is that companies, even though they say that they want to, successful companies, they get big and so forth, and they say they want to innovate, but in fact, what usually happens is some little company comes along, and they're the true innovators, and they wind up knocking off the big company. And the 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 question he poses is, well, why does that happen? And if and how do you prevent that from happening? And the same thing, if you really look deeply in the process that's used, you can find out, um, there's a lot about business for anybody that you can find out, and that's, I love his books. He, there are a couple of others on innovation. He also has a book called, which is a very good book, called "How Will You Measure Your Life," and that's another book that I would recommend.
The
Um,
Innovator's Dilemma. I'm gonna pull that up.
yeah. Okay.
Excellent stuff. Bo, this has been an honor to talk with you. I can only imagine you've sold maybe thousands and thousands and thousands of copies of your book. So, to talk to a real writer, somebody who's done a lot, been around the block with many top leaders of this generation, it's great to talk with you. And Ernest Hemingway, you're talking about how writing is sometimes difficult.
Uh-huh.
Ernest Hemingway has this great quote. He says, "Writing is easy. All you have to do is sit down at a typewriter and bleed." And that's it. So very therapeutic, but
Yeah.
you just get your soul down on a piece of paper
Well,
and
he also said that the hardest thing in the world is to write a true sentence. And that's where you bleed. You bleed when you try to, you know, write write something that you deeply believe is true.
I look at writing as such a is a self-awareness
Yeah.
technique, right? And so what's cool is I mean I'm a big believer in what Jordan Peterson says, and he says you
Yeah.
want an adventure in your life, start telling the
Yeah.
truth everywhere you go. No matter what, tell the truth to exactly what when you meet somebody, tell them the truth. You have no idea how they're going to respond. But whenever it comes to writing, if you talk in the same manner and you tell the truth everywhere, it is wild how that is very freeing and it does something to you where you know more about yourself, but also it does become an adventure because you're exposing your soul to the world, people who have no idea who you are.
Yeah. Well, that certainly describes Jordan Peterson. Of
Yeah,
course,
exactly. Yeah.
of course, it can also get you into a lot of trouble, as he's discovered.
Yeah, yeah, of course. That's why it's the ultimate adventure. Tell the truth. But anyways,
Right.
Bo Burlingham, it's been an honor to talk with you. I love this conversation. Small Giants, guys, pick it up. And that's just one of his books, but companies that choose to be great instead of big. Highly recommend anything by this guy because just by having
And
this
be sure to
conversation.
say 10th anniversary edition.
The 10th anniversary edition. Yes, that's the one that came out 2016, I believe. Is that right?
Yes, right,
Good
right.
stuff. Well, Bo, thanks so much, man.
Okay, well, thank you, Mike.
Remember, guys, $1 million book will lead to $1 million life. Right on.